So one of the objectives was to be able to compare this data with the US and Canada. We were able to keep the instrument quite similar. Lots of terminology changes, correcting our bad American spelling, etc. And some things were added, for example, more questions in the area of digitization. But there's a huge amount that can, in fact, be compared. The report, which is due to be published in January, Mike and I thought it'd be good to space out the 3 UDC-related reports so you don't have to read them all simultaneously. And it will have a section comparing the UK results, UK-Ireland results, with those in the ARL Libraries, the Association of Research Libraries, which you may know is the RLUK equivalent in the US. So I'm going to just have a couple slides each with some big picture outcomes, and then a list of the top 5 major challenges that were cited by respondents. And then most of the presentation is going to be telling you what the recommendations are that we came out with, and very, very, very selectively sort of showing you a few data slides with my own commentary on this. Unlike the report that I did for the US context, where I know that context and I could hoist my own opinions on, I think they're well-informed opinions. In the report, I very much, didn't want to, and was not appropriate for me to do that in this report, which is co-authored with 4 UK colleagues. Is Sue Worrell the only one who's in the room? For Sue, there she is. That's good. Let's hear it for Sue. She and Rachel Beckett helped present about the survey at the Aberdeen meeting last spring. And perhaps I should also mention, this is the 3rd RLUK meeting at which I presented about this. A year ago, it was a first look at the data. In the spring, it was with Sue and Rachel, a different kind of look at the data, selecting particular issues that seemed very important, and now outcomes. Also at Aberdeen, we looked at a draft set of recommendations that that the authors had put together and wrestled those to the ground. It seems overall that this is the overarching challenge for special ed collections. In a word, be relevant. And as we look at all the different kinds of issues surrounding research libraries in this day and age, might one say it's even the challenge of the research library in general, given tough times in general, and given the huge challenges of figuring out what we should be these days. Some of the particularly Pecha Kucha sessions yesterday were fantastic in terms of showing how we can be reinventing ourselves. Okay, big picture outcomes, and very much not taken from a particular question or set of questions, but from looking overall at the data. This one, the first one, alignment, sort of echoes the previous slide. It was clear, and the input from the RLUK librarians who participated so actively, and they were just hugely important in this project, is that there really is a major culture shift in special collections that needs to be dealt with. We'll see some information about educational needs and such. But lots of retraining and new skills is really going to be necessary. No surprise that philanthropic support is limited. That's not an issue related to special collections, it appears. Wonderful news, use has increased across the board in terms of all formats, all types of users, but on the preservation side, concerns about what that does to the condition of rare materials. For digital, the news is not good in terms of the extent to which those materials are being managed, let alone even actively collected. We'll never be able to satisfy users' hunger for having the rare materials and unique materials digitized. Still a lot of undiscoverable material. Some major harmony between this study and yours maps. And although a lot of cataloging backlogs have decreased, especially for printed volumes, some continue to grow. Okay. So the last question in the survey was, what are your 3 most challenging issues in managing special collections? And we used a social science research method name of which currently escapes me, to take all of those narrative answers, which were mostly a sentence or two, and categorize them into broad functional and other areas related to special collections management. Outreach, for example, was defined quite broadly to include any kind of engagement with the public beyond special collections, whether users in a reading room, use of digital collections, teaching, outreach, public programs, engagement with the university at various levels. So the broad definition we gave to that is, I think, one of the reasons why it came out on top, but the array of relevant issues is, I think, makes it warrant being on top. Space and facilities, we didn't have any, we had one question about space, and you'll see that, but when it came, so we didn't explore that in detail, but when it came to what are your biggest challenges, space, it's always space. More digital, see more about that. Collection care, talk a little bit about that. And then cataloging and archival processing that made it to 5. There were, a dozen or so categories that we ended up with. Administrative concerns, and a variety of others, but these were the top 5. In terms of the recommendations, a few things that's important to realize. I mentioned that the authors initially came up with a draft list of recommendations presented at Aberdeen, sort of ranked by the audience there, which was about 40 or 50 people, very much a combination of special collections, librarians and directors with university librarians. And something I noticed was that as everybody went up to the board and put their little red dots under different categories to indicate which recommendations they thought were important, dots went in very different places, whether the human being placing the dot was a university librarian or a special collections librarian. And that led to some complication about sort of coming up with a harmonious set of recommendations that would somehow balance the different perspectives. And we couldn't be entirely successful about that, but one of the things we did to try to sort of address that is that as I present the broad categories, by which I mean the categories of data collection, collections themselves, or digital, user services and outreach. We've kind of got them in very rough order that felt the most important to address, down to those that seemed somehow less powerful, less urgent. And very importantly, this report was very much vetted along the way by the 5 UDC board members who are RLUK directors, but it is a work of the authors, the 5 authors, and it is not meant to be a set of actions formally endorsed for RLUK action. More than half of the data is, after all, from non-RLUK libraries, and then the UDC report forthcoming in March is meant to fulfill that need, although I understand from Andrew and Mike that there will be a reasonable and sensible amount of overlap in these recommendations with those. Okay, we ended up feeling like staffing needs were very, very, very important because the consternation expressed by the directors of special collections who responded was, excuse me, and by, in some cases, especially the non-RLUK libraries, it was the library director formulating the response or a deputy director. So the narrative responses were written by people at a variety of levels, administrative levels. But in general, the notion, the sense, the very, very strong sense that new skills, new expertise are necessary was just really pervasive. There's a slide I'll show you that lists 15 or so different areas for potential educational and professional development needs, and so sort of really addressing which of those seem critical and coming up with a plan to provide that kind of development opportunities seems very important. These quotes from the narrative question, most of the quotes I've got here are taken from that. What are your most challenging issues? I have this here just to give you context in terms of size of staff across the RLUK libraries. and the vast difference in size of RLUK libraries, which of course are from the BL all the way down to the smaller the universities. The fact that the mean is twice the median shows you that range, but when it comes to capability to get various kinds of work done, the size of those staffs is quite relevant. And I would venture to say that compared to ARL libraries, your special collections are generously staffed, believe it or not. There are, of course, some ARL libraries that have enormous special collections staff, as there are here, but there are many that are very small. In terms of a change in number of staff, it was a really interesting question. It was really change in amount of staff time. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Can you read the little tiny legends at all? Are they visible? Okay, so I won't need to read them all off to you as I go along. The tall green bars are more staff, and the question was since the year 2000. So meant to show a very longitudinal change. And so the dark blue bars are fewer, the tall green are more staff. So numbers have gone up. We didn't ask what the numbers were. We knew from the US experience that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for people to tell us like the percent of change. And then this is change in allocation of staff time, which was meant to express where is the time going, and has it, what are you spending more time on than you were, 11 years ago? And I'll say that for the ARL responses, there were some really very, very clear differences. And for example, even though in terms of user education and outreach, even though that was expressed as a very prime need and hugely important, there was less staff time being devoted to it, which was quite strange. The long green lines, by the way, are more staff time. So what you see here is that the respondents generally said that more staff time is going into everything. Now, were those numbers of staff that increased over 11 years so great that all of these areas got more attention? I'm a little dubious about that. And based on conversations with my fellow authors, I had it, Sue, I hope you'll jump in at the end during the question period and tell me if you feel like I'm misrepresenting anything. But it was a sense that everyone's just working harder, as opposed to this being attributable to the fact that more staff has been assigned. So to me, it seemed somewhat as though this was reflecting the stress that a lot of heads of special collections feel that they and their staff are under. I will say that in the ARLs, it was very, very clear that one area completely outstripped the others in terms of more time being allocated, and that was technology and digital. Here it's, holding forth almost at the same level with sort of astonishingly administration. In the US, almost everyone was spending less time in administration. Here's that slide I mentioned regarding education and training needs, and what's that really, really, really long line for digital? And that's very much the case in the US, and in fact, 84% of RLUKs said that was a very prime need, and it was exactly the same number in the US. On the other hand, fundraising is ties for number 2 here with intellectual property. Fundraising was very low in the US. Special collections librarians really tend to have that skill and experience. And the number 2 need in the US was information technology of all kinds. One of the things that surprised me in both surveys is that almost down at the bottom, teaching ranked very low in terms of need for increased skills. I found that in both contexts, I found a little bit incongruous with the fact that, mainly in the UK context, I felt it somewhat incongruous the fact that a lot more training seems to be needed in outreach kinds of activities, but teaching not so often. And it might be that somehow the perception of what teaching means is quite different from the sort of educational outreach that special collections librarians tend to do. External funding. This started out by saying, raise more money, and which is, of course, the ultimate need, but develop a set of arguments to assist institutions with doing this, is how the recommendation came out. And we didn't have questions, we had implicit questions about funding in terms of size of your budget for collections care, for acquiring collections and things like that. But the data is really in those, in some of the comments made regarding future challenges. Outreach and user services, third in our list, staffing of fundraising and outreach in terms of the three most important areas in terms of the strength and importance of these recommendations. Develop an outreach toolkit that would include a lot of different kinds of materials helping librarians present their, improve their presentation skills. And on a much more sort of frontline, pedestrian, but important level, developing standardization, well, standardization is probably too strong a word, but more consistency across the sector in terms of policies for user-initiated digital scanning. Whether or not Special Collections allows that, to have users in the reading room with their digital cameras, in addition to doing scanning more writ large, is a controversial issue. It was hugely controversial in the U.S., and then we were astonished to see that among the ARLs, and indeed across the whole population of research libraries we surveyed, something like 80% were already allowing it. And the rest sort of immediately fell into line when they saw that it had, in fact, it had become a norm, and why are we fretting about this anymore? The numbers were lower here. I don't have them right at hand. I didn't include that slide, but these quotes, again, kind of echo that very opening, overarching issue that I noted of making sure people know we exist. Number of presentations. Presentations meaning any sort of public presentation, an exhibit, lecture, a course presentation, could be any kind of presentation, and then we divided it out by the nature of the audience. So you can see that the mean is 81, the median is 46. Remember back to those staffing numbers, the mean was 25 and the median was 12. Is this enough presentations I mean, would you as directors expect more outreach activity out of your special collections? Is this, I don't know what enough is, but for example, 22 course presentations over the course of the whole year. And again, that's median. But on a large university campus, even a small one, to me that would be far too little. And the US numbers are roughly the same, so we're not exactly out there as much as we, I think, often claim to be either. Social media is another interesting one, I think, for you as directors. So many categories might be a little hard to see, but the blue lines, which tend to predominate, are no plans to make use of these particular types of social media, such as, let's see, towards the right, user-contributed feedback, in other words, crowdsourcing of data. Other kinds of feedback as well, but generally that would refer to crowdsourced data. And, so roughly half of the RLUK is using blogs and Twitter, which were also the most common ones used in the US. But do you want to see your special collections engaging more via social media? There's been some interesting work done, reported at conferences more in the literature in the US in terms of the effectiveness and approaches to using those media to actually have an effect as opposed to just simply toe the line of being trendy. Interlibrary loan, here's the one where I really want to wag my finger, but I suppose what I really want to do is elicit a reaction from you all. Very different from the ARL and generally US statistics in the sense that interlibrary loan of rare and even sometimes unique, such as archived manuscript materials, is close to non-existent here. 81% nothing, never, no way, and then 16% of the rest is reproductions only. In the US, but only reproductions is something like a third, and then the percent that would loan original books was quite substantial, and over a third, and 40, I think it was, and materials in other formats, meaning archives, photographs, etc., was also quite low, but there's starting to be quite a conversation in the U.S. archival community about loosening up on that even. So in the discussions with my fellow authors, the prevailing opinion was our nation is small, everyone can travel to the collections. Because I had sort of drafted a recommendation about, in the service to researchers, try to, nudge this up a little bit. But I was overruled, and that's fine. But so I put the question to you, is this something that seems important to you as directors? Is it true that everyone can so easily travel that there's no, that you would place no importance on making some, it's never everything. No one's going to loan the Gutenberg or the Shakespeare Folio, but there are so many 19th, 20th, and 21st century materials going into special collections and building deep subject collections and such that to say, no, I will never loan anything, even when it is widely held, but usually in special collections and therefore not available to those who don't hold it. Is that sufficient? Or are your nations collectively so small that everyone can always travel?
I think you might find that the directors and the special collections librarians would have different views on that.
Chris says this might be an area where the directors and special collections librarians have different views. Absolutely echoing what's the case in the U.S. And while there are, increasingly heads of special collections are seeing the light about this, we are here to serve researchers. And we don't have a small country, and we do get loan requests from far beyond. Actually, a project we have going on in OCLC research is meant to address this. Sharing special collections will be the title of the report done by my colleague Dennis Massey. He worked with a working group to look at what are the issues in loaning, what are the reasons for the hesitation. What do you suppose the absolute number one is? Trust. It's not fear of loss in the mail, it's trust of your colleagues once it gets there to not lose it or mishandle it or have, the housekeeping staff open the container and whatever. So trust. At any rate, but I think much of the change in the last, I would say, 20 years or so in doing more loaning came from the emphasis of directors saying, you have such power. Here's another one that I would ask you to sort of really look at and think about as directors. Average charge for a digital scan. I can tell you that considerably more on average here than in the US. So 10% charge more than £15 for one digital scan. That's a lot of money. A third charge, this was kind of a very wide range, but between £6 and £15, but it's still only a third. So a half are charging less than £6. It's a lot of money for one digital scan. Is that acceptable? We have had, let's see, where's my, I don't have my most recent version on here. Oops. We produced a report, actually I think I have this slide later on, so I'll show it to you when I'm looking at digitisation. But we published a report that is meant to address this and facilitate streamlined procedures for doing this. It helps libraries do it more, special collections do it more frequently and easily, but that's a lot of money. And there is one RLUK that doesn't offer digital scanning for users. Shame on you, whoever you are. We have, OCLC Research has had, this is one of the two projects that we produced that were meant to assist in encouraging digital activity sort of on-site and on-demand as opposed to digitization of collections, sort of in the special collections reading room or one-by-one request. The first report was focused on why and how you can facilitate letting users use their own digital cameras. And I mentioned earlier that the statistics on that were, it's like everybody's doing it already, but it laid out sort of three levels of conservative to sort of middle of the road to very generous about what and how you let people do their own scanning. the liberal end was deemed the shutterbug method. Just let them do it, don't worry about the details. This one has, again, 3 levels of recommended workflow, from the sort of simplest to the most complex. The simplest being, get the thing made, give it or sell it to them, move on with your life. The most complex being, catalog it, go through a bunch, add it to your digital repository, sort of go the whole 9 yards. But the point was, if you can't afford, in terms of staff time or whatever reason, to do it in a complex way, then do it a simple way. But give them what they need. Born Digital, this sad story of how little is being done. Wonderful things being done within a very small number of repositories. So 2 recommendations. Get information out there about the basic steps in initiating such a program. And then look at the feasibility of exporting from those really experienced, productive, clever institutions, well-resourced institutions, technical environments to other less able institutions for reasons of staff, money, whatever. This, I cannot tell you, I have a similar site in the US, without of course the last line pertaining to the UK, but I can tell you that this is my most reproduced slide when I see people taking from my slide decks for their own presentations, and it really does kind of tell the story. And for 2 big reasons. Everyone needs to develop the capacity, which means, time, money, expertise. But that second one is there for you. This is not my quote. This is a quote from one of the respondents. This is a circumstance found by many of my colleagues in the United States as well. Strategy development. The tall bar is, we have a strategy in development. Maybe it's been in development for 10 years now, we don't really know, but there it is under development. And a third haven't even done anything. These numbers are better than they were in the US, though, believe it or not. Impediments to born digital management. The 3 tall bars completely match what we saw in the US and roughly in terms of the numbers as well. Lack of expertise, time, and funding. I have to say that, to me, I almost wished I had made this one open-ended rather than giving some canned responses, because I think those 3 were just magnets because they're so easy to claim. In turn, expertise, definitely. Why expertise isn't, lack of expertise isn't higher than that is what I don't understand. The education needs, you may have remembered, with that really long blue bar, something like 84%. But then time and funding, well, time is that, again, often from the top level of library administration saying, this is really important, we're going to do this, you are going to do this, you're going to find a way, I'll get you education. The funding, you can start without funding. You really can. The other results are also somewhat similar in the US, although, let's see, lack of support within the library. Far more of your respondents admitted this than in the US. And I thought, well, nobody wants to insult their director. But a quarter of them came right out and said, we don't have what we need at the top, from the top. We have, in OCLC research, my colleague Ricky Irway and I, who has also long been our digitization guru, we have a project currently on, which you can find described in detail on our OCLC research homepage, Demystifying Born Digital. We are not doing research in developing software, methodologies, theory, any of this. What we're doing is trying to come up with a few very brief papers that help people get started. Because one of the things that's really intimidating about Born Digital is that there's so much information out there, there's so many tools, there's so much research, most of it done at very high levels, and it's massively intimidating. So we want to help people get started, and some of you have no doubt picked up all of the handouts that we brought. The first one came out several months ago, 3 pages, a dozen steps, start with inventorying, do some prioritizing. It says sort of, here's how you inventory Born Digital material on physical media, and then a dozen steps for, here's how you copy a file. So really, really low level, but the point is get the content off of that incredibly fragile, unreliable, losable physical medium onto a secure server. And the uptake on this report has been incredible. One of the units within the Society of American Archivists is currently having a contest. Send in, tell us how you've implemented this initial steps, first steps for implementation, and you'll get a free course, a free digital education course from the Society of American Archivists. It's quite a gift, it's hundreds of dollars. And then the second report just came out about a month ago, and we're also getting some good uptake on it. More or less applies to that second recommendation. By the way, the first report very much matches one of the recommendations that we have in this report. And this one looks at how can we collaborate in the places where it gets hard. That first, 12 Simple Steps report is focused on the easiest material in physical media that is contemporary enough that you probably, that you still have the machinery around that you can stick. Everybody can still find a machine with a 5-inch floppy drive, right? But if you have punched cards or an Apple II from the 80s or other truly obsolete formats, hard drives that are 20 years old, you're not, for everyone to be able to do that in-house would be just nuts. So are there institutions or services that will do this for money, but at a very reasonable price? Reasonable price would, of course, be huge, to enable others to get it done. Yeah. I'm going to slowly. Actually, Mike already talked about the national strategy for digitization, which is much wanted here, and then also developing cost-effective methods for large-scale digitization. Do it all, please. Very similar results as for ARL. Nearly half of you say that you have done large-scale digitization. We had a very similar result. Ricky did a follow-up project with some of the institutions that claimed they had done this, and far from it, almost none had really achieved large scale. I think they focused on the part of the definition that says entire collections and kind of ignored the part about streamlined production at scale, meaning entire, large bodies of material. For example, one of them was we did 1,500 photographs in a month. That's not really large scale. So how much material, how large were the collections? We don't have that data here, but I'm, as in the U.S. where our dubiosity was proven correct, I would have the same question here. 3 slides, and you'll have the slide deck, so you'll be able to look at these more. But projects that we have done in the last few years really trying to encourage digitization at scale. And this third one, a one-page sort of little manifesto, a guideline on, rather than be frozen stiff by copyright fears, here is a way you could approach digitization of collections of, orphan works, or materials where you might even fathom who the copyright holder is, but go ahead and do it anyway because you really don't have to fear anything. Conversion of existing data for archival collections and simplified faster, aka faster, processing archival collections was another area where I kind of felt pushback from my fellow authors. In the U.S., these things are really accepted now. We can't make it perfect. We have to get rid of those backlogs. And so there's more work, I think, to do on your parts to push. Internet access to finding aids, doing great. You've got these various national systems where there's a lot of material, and you've got 2/3, and this is almost the same as what you saw in the slide about archival. 2/3 of them are online, and you beat ARL. ARL, it's only 55% or something like that. So, but there is still almost 40% that are not discoverable online. So, hence the desirability of doing faster processing, even if it's imperfect. Or, a quarter of the collections would be online if you would just take that older data, which is no doubt imperfect, and get it up there. 2/3 of you are doing some simplified processing. We didn't ask how often. Metrics was the area where perhaps in Aberdeen there was the most huge variation between directors and special collections librarians in terms of importance. And we ended up with a recommendation that says determine the potential value and how to use. Yes, there are a lot of things we can't measure well. Some of those objectives for a national registry couldn't be achieved without better metrics, but how incredibly important is it, considering that the effort would probably go into trying to devise them. We're going through exactly the same dilemma in the US and haven't really gone anywhere. Collaborative collection development, I'm just going to zip through these now. Andrew said he didn't have very many minutes, but to be fair. 40% of you are using secondary storage, far lower than the ARLs where it's well over 2/3. So your space crunch isn't as bad as it is back at home. Collaborative collection development, the tall bars are all we don't do any. So I loved Christine Wise's presentation yesterday and would love to know more about what they've got going on there. Cartographic materials, yes, they are not cataloged. My theory is that it's because map collections organize them geographically, and so you still have a lot of access. I think that's why. I really don't know why I'm not a map person. And 16% of printed volumes still not online, so kind of similar. So it's kind of nice with data magic. The blue lines are decreased backlogs. 40% of the book backlogs have decreased, only a quarter of archival. Collection care, huge concerns on the part of the librarians about use causing wear and tear and but overall, we didn't feel that these recommendations had sort of the power to put them higher. Collection care needs, that really tall one is printed in volumes. We have medium needs, etc. So the light green ones are medium. Let's see, where's the high? It's so tiny on my screen, I can barely see it. The dark green. I was fascinated by the fact that printed volumes, archives, have pretty much the same level of problem, high, as the really fugitive materials like audiovisual and more digital. I think that's overly conservative. The last two slides, how to continue building and profiting from this community built by not only this survey, but the ones done previously. A lot of non-RLUK libraries, but what I've heard is what would really be the benefit. It's such a disparate bunch. What could we really do that would be good? But I would, having done this work, I would love to see something come out of that, but the ones that know, what would make any sense?